Thank you very much. Thank you, Laura, for the invitation and for having me. My name is Edward Rinkanya. I work for the Communications Authority of Kenya, that is the industry regulator in the Republic of Kenya. Representing my CEO, Madam Mase Wajau. Unfortunately, she could not join us for today's event, having been called to another urgent meeting, which the timings is actually going on at the moment. So I have been asked to make this presentation on her behalf. Thank you very much. And she does send her apologies. She would have wished to personally attend and make the presentation, but we'll do our best to represent Madam Wajau. Now, this presentation is from the regulator's perspective. This, we are the Communications Authority of Kenya. Indeed, we have been regulating the ICT industry for 20 years. In fact, this year, 2020, we are celebrating our 20 years since we're established as the industry regulator in Kenya. So I'm happy that we have been invited to make this presentation during this particular time, as we have our celebrations for 20 years. So I'll quickly take you through we have prepared a few slides, which I'll use in my presentation. This is the Regulatory Reform and Innovation in ICTs, a Delicate Balancing Act. Now, the CA is established under the Kenya Information and Communications Act, and our mandate is to regulate the ICT industry. We cover various fields, including the radio communication, telecommunications, broadcasting, postal and courier services, competition aspects, and universal service. Now, what is the essence of regulation? Why do we need to regulate the industry? We recognize that the regulatory reform is intended to enhance the positive regulatory effect on innovation. So from the onset, we are there, in fact, as an enabler, not really to either punish those who fail, but really to enable innovation in the industry. The regulatory process must take into account the effects of regulation on innovation, as well as the implications of technical changes for the rationale and design of regulation. The traditional approach to regulation began to change fundamentally in the late 1990s in the wake of surge of new players interested in investing in ICTs and major shifts in information and communication technology, such as the mobile telephony and the dawn of the internet. As mobile phones became the portals of an ever-growing array of online services, regulators are being forced to grapple with a host of new challenges, ranging from digital identity to data protection, privacy, blockchain, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and big data. So there are three types of regulations or regulatory aspects: economic, social, and administrative regulations. This is the regulatory aspect that either economic, social, or administrative that the government puts in place to ensure that there is sanity in the industry. And in our particular case, we are really looking at the administrative regulation, which is basically, in the case of Kenya, this is governed under the Constitution. We have the Constitution of Kenya 2010. We do have an ICT policy. We do have the Kenya Information and Communications Act, the regulations thereunder, and various guidelines. We are saying that with the rights enabling regulatory framework, ICTs have the potential to dramatically transform the access to education, healthcare, environment, management, and agriculture, opportunities for trade, entrepreneurship, and provision of government services. We are the part of CA, we push for collaborations. We believe that collaboration is key, so that this push for the access to, we would have we have to have the remote, may I take that again, pushing access out to remote areas and getting the remaining. From our statistics, we have about 51% of the world who are online, so we are pushing this to have the remaining 49% also to get online for a better life. The collaboration aspect is also with our stakeholders. What we do is we work with our stakeholders as opposed to pushing things down the throat of our stakeholders. We invite them, we have stakeholder engagement so that the regulations or the regulatory aspect is actually stakeholder stakeholder based. Now there are various emerging technologies that the regulator is arrived to, and various innovations, including digital startups, digital lenders and financial technologies, wireless technologies, mobile money, virtual currency, 3D printing, big data, and AI, blockchain, and the various other technologies that are emerging. So this trend is speaking of the need to bridge, to have the innovations and to bridge innovation and regulatory compliance. So what we do as a regulator is we undertake benchmarks on the best regulatory practices, implement standards such as the Commonwealth Standard on OTTs, undertake law and policy reform to address emerging digital technologies, invest in capacity building and awareness, as well as engage in structured stakeholder collaborations and partnerships. So in Kenya, the regulatory framework is based on various laws, including the Constitution of Kenya. We have the Kenya Information and Communications Act. We have 16 sets of regulations. These regulations include frequency management, postal and courier services, broadcasting services, competition aspects, consumers, and tariffs. So we have various regulations touching on each of those aspects as per our mandate and under the Act and the Constitution of Kenya. With emerging technologies, collaborative regulation, we also have a collaborative regulation with other government agencies, including the Central Bank of Kenya, the Competition Authority of Kenya, and the Media Council of Kenya, and various other. This is just an example of the other agencies that we collaborate with. So the reforms have also ushered in cyber security, universal access on e-commerce. So we do have the Computer Misuse and Cyber Crimes Act, which was recently registered in the year 2019. We do have provisions regarding the universal access and provisions on electronic e-commerce, and e-commerce basically being under the Kenya Information and Communications Act, but the offenses there are now covered under the Computer Misuse and Cyber Crimes Act. Now, the touching on compliance is the theme of of the presentation is indeed we are balancing the regulations and compliance. Then the focus here is what our mandate is under the Constitution. With our licensees, we do have terms and conditions of the license conditions. We have an ICT policy. It's a new one, 2019. The laws, the regulations, and guidelines. So that this is the framework that allows us now to ensure that there is compliance. There are tools for compliance we use, including the broadcast loggers, radio spectrum monitoring stations, the QoS, and experience tools. We do that is on monitoring. We also do inspections, and then where any of our licensees has failed to comply, then we would have to enforce. We require submission of compliance reports, mainly on quarterly basis, and then the compliance in the law and regulatory aspects. There are various milestones. I did mention at the beginning of the presentation that we have been around for 20 years. During those 20 years, there are various milestones that we are proud of, and as we celebrate the 20 years, these are some of what we need, what we show for it. There are various reforms that were undertaken in the year 2013. This was mainly to align the law with the Constitution. The Constitution having the new Constitution having come into force in the year 2010, various regulatory reforms were undertaken. Indeed, before then, the now Communications Authority was called the CCK, but now after the reforms to align ourselves with the new Constitution, these reforms took place in 2013. Then we rebranded to the Communications Authority of Kenya, as opposed to the previous name. So various things that we have to show for it is the digital migration of the year 2015, rollout of 4G networks and 5G strategy, Cyber Security Center, the National Public Key Infrastructure and NPKI, the consumer forums, we call them Kikao Kikus, enhanced visibility through opening of regional offices, universal access projects, that is USF projects, revised national broadband strategy. We licensed MNOs. Then we have undertaken the competition study, which is being implemented. And then we have various strategic partners. In conclusion, so as to realize positive regulatory effects on innovation, while taking care not to jeopardize the original regulatory objectives, a regulatory ought to understand the regulation technology linkages to ensure competition, streamline regulation, use technology-driving approaches, and harmonize, have international harmonization of the various of our framework on regulatory aspects on ICT. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Okay, thank you very much, Edward, and I'll go right after you. Thank you for the presentation. And my name is Mccoy, and I work with the Smart Africa Secretariat. Smart Africa is a Pan-African organization. We have 30 member states, and our vision is to transform the continent Africa into a single digital market. Now, what we do is to try to put ICT at the center of every aspect of people's lives. So, until now, we have been able to launch a number of blueprints that cuts across the digital economy, broadband, data protection, startups, and a whole lot of others. One thing we also seek to do in terms of policy and regulation is to harmonize. We believe that as a Pan-African organization, there's no need to have segregated policies. And so we have a number of projects where we seek to harmonize policies and regulation. Now, to the topic of today, balancing regulations, compliance, and innovation. I'd like to take it from the innovation aspect, and I'll attempt to answer three questions. How are the end user demands dictating innovation, targeting various market segments? How is Smart Africa coping with these demands? And to what extent does regulations complement these innovations? So I'm going to start from entrepreneurship. I'll touch on data markets, and then I'll touch on connectivity. In terms of entrepreneurship, as you may know, Africa has the youngest population as a continent. We have about 20% of our population are youth. We have about 11 million of youth entering the workforce every year. And however, with this 11 million, only 3.1 million jobs exist for these people. So you see that there's a demand for jobs, there's a demand for people to work, but we don't have the necessary regulations. What are the regulations that have been implemented to be able to support this demand? There's no such regulation. I'll talk about it later when I get to the solutions. How we want to deal with the 9 million or so youth that come out into the job market but do not have access to job. Then I move to data privacy. In terms of data privacy, I think it even became very apparent when we had this coronavirus pandemic. When we had to trace people, there was a lot of hula baloo on data privacy and how to protect people, how to use people's data very responsibly. Again, what are the regulations? When you go into Africa, when you go into our member states, you realize a few of us have the regulations. Some those who have regulations don't even support cross-border data flows. And I talk about cross-border data flows because now that most countries are reopening, we need to be able to share data across borders. We need, if I'm traveling from Nairobi to Kigali, my data should be in Kigali by the time I arrive in Kigali for them to know my status in terms of coronavirus. But do we have laws and regulations supporting us in this regard? I'll answer that also. Then the last being connectivity. Connectivity is the basic enabler. Without connectivity, all that we are doing, it will be quite difficult. And again, during coronavirus, we saw user demand. Connectivity is a real need. There was at least 70% increase in internet traffic. And we see that there's a real demand for internet. But do we have the infrastructure? What are the regulations that, help us to have this digital infrastructure in place? It doesn't exist. So I'll attempt to answer these three questions, and then would also superimpose it on the regulatory aspect. What do we need to do? Now, the first part being entrepreneurship. If we have 9 million people, youth, energetic, coming out into the workforce but not being employed on a yearly basis, for me, it's a security issue. And as much as it's a security issue, I believe that there's a lot of things that we can do. What can we do? We can create an innovative or a conducive startup environment. We need to be able, as regulators, to be able to create funding mechanisms, because one of the major things that the youth need to be able to be successful is to create funding mechanism. We can create tax holidays. We need to be able to create places for them that makes working as an entrepreneur, or even developing their ideas. We need to give them idea studios to be able to flesh out their ideas and move it into commercial. These are some of the regulations that we need to be able to put out there based on demand. This is actual demand that we have. In terms of data privacy, at Smart Africa, we are working on a project to develop a framework for data privacy in protection in Africa. And as we started the work, we realized that it's only about, let's say, 29 countries in Africa, have data protection regulation. But even out of that, and a lot of them do not allow cross-border data. And for me, well, COVID opening up is one use case for us to have cross-border data flows. But most importantly, how are we going to make sure that the free trade agreement is a success? The essence of the free trade agreement that we are having is for Ghana to be able to freely trade with Kenya. It's for Burundi to be able to freely trade with Algeria. So if we don't, as regulators, put cross-border data flows, if we don't encourage cross-border information flow, how are we going to be successful? So this is one thing that we need to do in terms of regulation. There is the demand. The demand is there. We've seen it during this COVID pandemic, but also we need it for the trade agreement to be successful. When we did the mapping, what came out is that only two countries, I think it's Ghana and Mauritius, and I'm not saying it because I come from Ghana. It's only two countries who allow cross-border data, and I think that it's time that we start thinking about data liberalization. I know we've spoken a lot about data privacy, we've spoken about data protection, but we need to start thinking and talking about how do we liberalize data in a responsible manner. I know that there are trust issues, but we could also develop the framework that allows us to be able to share data in a very responsible manner. The last one is connectivity. As I said earlier, the COVID has shown us that. I mean, we are having this webinar today. I'm in Kigali. I'm at home, and I'm able to have this webinar with you all. And the line enabler is connectivity. We need to be able to set up the right spectrum policies, the right usage of universal access as regulators. So on connectivity, we need to be able to, as regulators, we need to be able to set up things around a proper use of the universal access fund. We need to be able to support infrastructure sharing, a whole lot. And on all these three things that I've spoken about, Smart Africa has gone ahead to develop blueprints, strategies to be able to support to move forward in terms of regulation. And I'm happy that this topic came up, because these three things are things that have come up based on actual user demand. Our changing lifestyles are driving these three pillars. However, I feel like in terms of regulation, in terms of being able to regulate these three domains, we need to do some more work on it. And we are happy to support from the Smart Africa perspective in terms of developing frameworks, in terms of working hand in hand with member countries. As I mentioned, we have 30 member countries that we are working on. And in all these three, we are done with the blueprint. We are going on to develop pilot projects, supporting countries to develop regulations that will help them in moving forward. Now, finally, I'll just answer the last question, which is, What should enterprises be looking out for in a rapidly changing environment? I think that the buzzword, especially in this period, has been digitization. We need to see as Africa, how do we digitize in our context? I don't believe in copy paste. As you know, we have a peculiar success story, for instance, in mobile money. I believe that also in Africa, we need to see how do we digitize. If we are going to be digitizing education, for instance, what happens to the people at the in the rural areas, the people who don't have connection? How are they going to also not in making sure that we don't leave them behind? How are we going to solve that? And so to end, I would say that in balancing regulation and innovation, um, regulation has already gone ahead of us, but it's time that we move from regulatory format that we knew. Let's move on to a regulatory regime that is more accommodative, more agile, and a regulatory that listens, but also is not left behind from the innovation. So that's it from me. I hope I'm well within time. Thank you, and over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Talma. Adam, before as you're loading your presentation, just to let the audience know, please remember to post your questions in the Q&A window, and then we'll have you, Adam, and then Caroline, and then we go into the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I hope you can hear me. Let's see how we can put my slides up. They're already loaded, so maybe Felix can get them ready to show everybody. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Adam Lane. I'm the Deputy CEO of Government Affairs at Huawei Kenya. And I don't have many slides to show you. I hope that we can get them up at some point. So I think you all know who Huawei is. Now in basically every country in the world, certainly everywhere in Africa, helping provide a lot of technology solutions and very R&D intensive. So actually we're hugely focused on innovation. It's a very important part of our business. And I think now we're in the top 5 in the world in terms of number of patents that are being filed every year, both at the European, US, and China level as well. Our business, of course, is very broad, covering devices, connectivity, computing, cloud, and all kinds of other related solutions, including some software, but we're not an internet company in the sense that we don't make money off like advertising. We don't make money off things like subscription services or people's data. So I think that does differentiate us from some of the other companies that are big in this space, especially some of the US ones. Now, when it comes to innovation, I wanted to talk about a topic called about standards. Now, I think it's quite interesting. I thought we'd pick an angle on this topic slightly different to what maybe everybody else would be talking about. And standards is something that is very, very dear to our hearts at Huawei, but it's something that people don't often think very much about. I think the only time I hear people mention standards in Kenya or in Africa is the fact that they lack of contributions from those in Kenya or Africa to global standards bodies, for example, which is definitely a shame and something that has to be worked on. Unfortunately, it is quite a big contribution in terms of time, as much as it is in terms of actual technical knowledge. And of course, it's often the bigger companies, or in this case, for some of the regulatory agencies representing some of their citizens, that can then join some of these meetings and join some of these standards bodies. But they are very important. Here you'll see a very simple, on the left, flow in terms of where basic research starts, based on what you as a company want to develop and based on what you think customers would want. Then, of course, you start to apply that research. Then you look at actually developing it, and then you have pre-development with prototypes, and then you have actual commercial products and solutions. And in our perspective, you can see a rough kind of timeline here that some of this stuff is taking 3, 4, 5 years before something becomes commercial. And our role in terms of the role of standards is kind of in between the innovation aspect, where you come up with a totally new idea, and then something that actually is commercialized, a product or solution. And the role of standards is often the cooperation amongst the industry. It's around building a market, and it's around cooperating with customers. And you can see that it fits quite nicely as a triangle with R&D, research and development, and with the IPR, intellectual property rights and intellectual protection. So that's a very important aspect, of course. IPR in terms of patents are different to standards. Standards are open and anyone can use them. Anyone can develop them and submit them to the relevant bodies and participate in those standard settings processes, whether at a regional or global or industry or even at a national level. So they are very different to patents, but they're also very important, potentially even more important. And I can probably explain a little bit more why on the next slide. So the way I see it is that standards really unite the industry ecosystem, and that enables innovation. So let's look on the first box on the left. We talk about developers. So of course, developers are about building strong ecosystems in the technology world, and we need them to build a strong industry. We need people to be developing towards common tools, common platforms, and so on. And that's very important. Then in terms of the specific standards themselves, whether they're open source technologies or they're just standards on its own, it's around joint innovation. So standards enable you to have common definitions. They enable interoperability between different pieces of hardware, different pieces of software, and other aspects. They involve interoperability of platforms and the creation of platforms that others can build on. They enable compatibility. So different systems can work together and you can buy from different companies, and in theory, they will be able to work together. And it also enables safety. The most critical topic, but safety is a very important topic. And lots of safety standards around technology as well as other areas to make sure that something is safe. And you can trust that it's safe if it's been certified as meeting a standard that's gone through a certain process. The third part is around industry alliances. And this is really around where you shape the industry and where organizations come together on a specific topic or theme and create certain standards. I'll give some examples later on in the presentation. It can be vertical alliances, it can be horizontal alliances, it can be all across industries, or it can just be within one industry, and it's very important. And then the fourth part is around business alliances. So this will maybe more closed, but they're also where standards play an important role, where you would work together with customers or with suppliers or with other vendors. You develop cooperation schemes in terms of R&D. You develop certification programs and training programs, like Huawei has a Huawei Certified Internet Associate, for example, and so on. You often see, I think even we have, a smartphone case that's certified as being made for Huawei or meeting Huawei's requirements. You can use that on your smartphone, for example. Business alliances are very important, especially when you look at the supply chain. Supply chains are very, very complex nowadays, and that's a big weak point in terms of the collaboration and coordination and cooperation within an industry. Now, one example that standards are very interesting and very important that I want to emphasize is cybersecurity, especially in the technology industry, where people are always in a rush, in a hurry. They're always launching things in alpha and beta and whatever other kind of mode before it's ready and when it's not very secure. And so we believe cybersecurity standards are very important. And I guess what's very important around standards is standards can then be met. It's like it's a very clear, black and white standard that you can meet or not meet, or meet to a certain level of A or B or C or gold or silver or something like this. And that then gives you the confidence, or gives the customer or the partner the confidence that you meet that standards. And that's really important. And we think that's very helpful for our industry and technology. So Huawei has a lot of certifications around all kinds of aspects. You can see supply chain security, information security, and other things. We really recommend people look at the role of standards in enabling them this innovation ecosystem. And my final slide then was just some examples of some of these innovation, some of these standards, and some of these organizations that play a role in the ecosystem. So there's some, for example, around the Automotive Industry Alliance that's looking at technology in vehicles, so that then the vehicles could actually communicate with each other, as well as communicating with street furniture like traffic lights, for example, or bus stops. And that's very important. Otherwise, you would have ecosystems that wouldn't be able to communicate with each other, and that would be a huge problem, and also would hold back innovation. So that's ecosystem kind of building. You also have in IoT, I think now there's a lot more effort to look at common standards for IoT at the home base, where you have these smart speakers that maybe can actually collaborate with each other in the future, or that you can build services on things like smart speakers that will work across all the smart speaker platforms, for example. So just a few interesting examples there. Now, there is this issue, and I think it is important that we need to have more representation of local organizations, whether academia, whether businesses, whether governments in the global standards bodies, partly to contribute to make sure these standards are relevant to the local situation here, but also to be able to learn from those standards and be able to apply them here and utilize them and becoming an innovative organization. And you can see Huawei is quite active in many of these organizations. We can, I guess, afford to be as a global company, and we have a very deep and broad R&D operation. But it's something we need to think about what we can do more with entities locally in Kenya, in Rwanda, in Ghana, and the rest of Africa. So I will leave it there. I can take some more questions later. On my very final slide, there's just a web address if you'd like to have a look a bit more, some information around where we believe openness, collaboration, and shared success are important in driving innovation and the ecosystem. And that we think standards, I think, play a very important part of that, where they're very clear, they're very black and white, they're very transparent, and they really can help drive the interconnected aspects of the ecosystem, which is critical for innovation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Caroline, are you ready? Thank you for those of you who have posted your questions in the Q&A window as we wait for Caroline to come on board. Please continue posting your questions in the window so that we're able to answer them through and through as we go along. I see quite a number of presentations have been put in the handouts window as well, so you can just go there and download any of the presentations that we've gone through today and just go through them in your own time. We're still waiting for Caroline. So while we wait for Caroline, I think I will start taking us through the Q&A. Edward, I see a question here from Alois. If you could just unmute yourself.
Yes,
Okay,
I'm on, thank you.
Okay, Caroline, are you ready to go with your presentation?
Yeah, thank you very much, and apologies for that. I seem to just had an issue with my connection, so I'll just go straight ahead. As it has been mentioned, my name is Caroline Bugwa, Senior Policy Manager, Sub-Saharan Africa, and I lead at the GSMA, and I lead policy and regulatory activities in the East Africa region. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this great team discussing this very important topic. I'm happy to see some familiar faces on the panel. Just to go straight into it, just a brief introduction of who the GSMA is. So the GSMA is an industry organization that represents the interests of mobile network operators worldwide. We have more than 750 operators as full members of the GSMA, and a further about 400 companies in the broader mobile ecosystem that are associate members. Thank you very much for this opportunity. So I'll just go straight to it. So today we understand the value. Today we understand the value of being connected like never before. Mobile operators have invested almost $1 trillion in network infrastructure over the past 5 years, bringing mobile internet coverage to about 91% of the world's population. And coming close to this topic that we are discussing, traditionally innovation is usually ahead of regulations, and this is not a problem that is unique to Sub-Saharan Africa only. This is an issue that cuts across the entire globe. It's important that we strike a balance between ensuring that we have a regulatory environment that is enabling innovation in any country in order for us to unlock the true potential of the benefits of our technology. I'm glad that we have a representative from the Communication Authority in this panel, and I was really excited when you're going through your different discussions, because indeed striking that balance is very important, because it is important that we make sure that we follow the different regulations and comply, but also give room to innovation for innovation to actually grow and thrive. So moving right along, the mobile industry has connected again every day and continues. Despite this, but we still have what we call a usage gap. This is the gap between the connected and those that are actually they are covered but are actually not using the internet services. And so far, this is about the internet broadband services network, but are not using the internet services. This in this category of citizens, female and tend to be perhaps in most cases are not literate. And when you look at this figure, really, if you try and imagine the number of people, you're talking about 3.3 billion people across the globe. This is a significant number of users that are connected but do not actually take advantage of the services or connectivity. It is important that we find innovative ways to solve this and where they are. And I think as one of my about where we are and the cracks that coronavirus has exposed us to, looking at the in the sub-Saharan Africa region, for instance, and just as I move on to my next slide, we to come closer home, if you look at the figures in sub-Saharan Africa, we're looking at about 550 million people who are actually covered by broadband services, but do not subscribe to internet services. This is a huge population, in my view, and in many to a lot of the youth, women, and also a lot of the people in the rural areas, etc. And I think, in my view, this is where really innovation comes in, because innovation comes in to develop solutions that are targeted at this particular group of individuals. And of course, also looking at the issue of coverage, we still have about 24% of people in sub-Saharan Africa who still remain unconnected, and this is also an area. And if you look at the hardest to reach, as opposed to where we've been so far, because 24% in most cases represents citizens that are in far to reach areas. So we need to start looking at innovative ways to continue closing that usage gap, and of course continue closing that coverage gap. And in most cases, and according to a lot of the research we have identified the barriers to internet adoption. And if you look at the barrier to adoption, hindrances for people getting on board or for people to continue remaining, we need to start having a keen focus and the innovations. It's the issue of digital literacy and innovations we bring digital skills and closer to a lot of people and making people understand the benefits of internet, like mobile money, for instance. The financial digital skills have skyrocketed, and because of an innovation that came into play. So looking at ensuring that digital skills are improved, and looking at how different stakeholders in the ecosystem can look at this particular issue. And of course, the other issue is affordability. Affordability is also very critical to enhance actions that have a keen focus on the adoption of internet services, and looking at, and mainly when we talk about affordability of the service itself, the gadgets that we use, etc., and looking at innovation. Affordability continues to be a key agenda in driving innovation and driving that balance that the digital skills part that I had discussed about. And as a GSMA, we have a mobile internet skills toolkit. This is for that we use to accelerate digital literacy in different markets. So the tool has entry level in terms of the different individuals who are at different levels in having different classes that have the different content that would be able to be relevant to the different categories. And of course, another key thing is looking at safety and security, different categories of individuals online. With everybody going online right now, especially the younger generation. So looking at how to have that environment or other vulnerable groups continue feeling safe as the internet continues to provide. And of course, last but not least, of course, also looking at the issue of access. It still continues to be an issue in the region. We still have about, a good percent of people, as we talked about, the 24% of citizens not covered in the region. So looking at how do we make sure that we have innovative solutions that can be able to address this particular issue of access, so that we make sure everybody is covered and no one is left behind. So these are just some of the barriers. And another key barrier that I wanted to discuss is, of course, relevance, and looking at innovations that actually speak to specific challenges and specific issues that people are actually facing. So this is also another key area to making sure that we continue increasing the number of consumers that continue to sign up for internet services, so that as we talk about digitizing the people that, or rather the different citizens, we make sure that everybody is included. And as a GSMA, we have what we call a GSMA Innovation Fund, where we normally have grantees that go through as a process, an internal process, and we fund different innovations across sub-Saharan Africa and of course in Asia, looking at coming up with innovations in this particular area. So looking at innovations that will be able to be scaled up, that are sustainable, innovations that are actually that would actually be able to have that social economic impact that you're looking for, and innovations that would be able to accelerate internet adoption and digital inclusion. So when we talk about the different innovations in this particular aspect, so if you look at this particular slide that I'm sharing, this talks about the different innovations that we have funded. If you see this, it cuts across the entire globe and of course up to Asia, and looking at especially the areas that we've talked about, areas of accelerating internet adoption and of course digital inclusion. So as I conclude and coming back to the topic of this day, I'd like to just conclude by saying that as I conclude, I'd like to come back and talk about what the colleague from the Communication Authority has mentioned, the issue of collaboration, because I believe that we need to have a more collaborative approach to regulation in order for us to meet the objective of stakeholder involvement and ensure that the usage gap is solved and continue to transform their lives, especially of the digitally excluded. I go back to my statement before, and in my view, for this to happen, we need to look at technology and make and because technology is not a respecter of borders. So in this collaboration that we're talking about, we need to involve international community, because this is not a challenge that is just unique to Kenya. This is a challenge that is unique to the region and of course the globe. And of course, as he also rightfully mentioned, capacity building sessions will also be key to just make sure that we are in line and continue to keep tabs with the innovations that are coming up. And last but not least, I would also want to bring up, or just for us to start having that discussion of the mind around regulation in itself needs to go through some form of evolution. And if you look at the innovations that have been coming up, they are not per se defined in the new verticals that we understand them. They are not per se, just focused on maybe one particular area. You may find an innovation that cuts across different verticals. So we need to also regulations need to evolve to a point where we are able to look at these particular innovations and look at how best does innovation evolve, and maybe go through some form, rightfully come up with the environment that will continue providing an environment that is conducive for innovation to continue growing. I believe that the regulators are already in a good place and have made some great for us to continue responding to the needs that are out there and responding to the innovations that continue to come up. But I do believe that we have what it takes as a region, and we're able to actually come together and improve our regulatory environment. So for now, that is what I had. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the questions that may come after this. Thanks.
Thank you, Caroline. You have soldiered through that presentation in as much as you are in and out and some great content there. So thank you so much to all our speakers. The content has been fantastic, well prepared. I've tried to learn quite a bit, even though I also had my technology issues, so I'll have to go back and listen to the recording.